This video will be for a neck facing. So for this one, you have quite a few pieces. We're going to have a full front. So this one is mirrored with both sides of the garment. So I have that one cut out here. We are going to use for the back, we're going to be using our invisible zipper sample. So you should have those two backs that you stitch together with your invisible zipper in there. We're going to be attaching the neck facing to that. And then you're going to need the actual facing pieces. So you will have a front neck that looks like this. It's a mirrored piece, so it should have that full U shape. We just need one of those. And then the fusing piece to go with it. And then for the back neck, you're going to have two separate. So it's shaped like this, and you'll cut two, a left and a right. Always make sure to flip it to get that second one. So you should have two separate pieces just like that. And then same with the fusing piece. It has that same shape, and we will be cutting it twice. Okay, the first thing we need to do is fuse these pieces. So I'm gonna go ahead and attach these fusings to the back of each of my facings. And I'm using two different color fabrics for the facing and for the garment, just so it's a little bit easier to see what's happening on screen. Make sure that when you're adhering this fusible interfacing to your fabric, that you have that bumpy side down so that the glue is touching your fabric and not your iron. Okay, as always, make sure that you check that that's fully adhered before you move on. Okay, now we're going to attach our garment at the shoulder and side seam. So I'm going to take my front piece and my back piece, lay those right sides together, and we're going to attach both of those shoulders and side seams. Okay, I have those pinned. I'm gonna stitch those, but I also wanna be efficient. So we're also going to attach our facings at the shoulder. So this is our neckline, and then this is part of our shoulder seam. So I'm going to take my front and my backs and lay them right sides together. Make sure that this back one, it's easy to get confused on which side is center back and which side is the shoulder. So as you're doing this, if you need to compare it back to your pattern piece, make sure that you're matching the shoulder and not accidentally flipping it. Okay. And I see mine are not quite matching up as far as the width goes. They should, but I think that's a little bit of a pattern error. So what I'm gonna do is match it up at that neckline because that's most important, and I'm gonna leave it separated at the edge. That'll be a mistake that we'll have to get fixed on the pattern at least. Okay, so looking at that, you should have those shoulders pinned together. Center back is gonna stay open for now. So let's go stitch all of those seams on our sewing machine. Okay, now I'm gonna start by stitching my shoulder seams at 1/2 inch. So that was my first side seam, and now my second side seam. Okay, now I'm going to stitch those shoulders that are on my facings. Again, this will be at 1/2 inch. So once that's stitched, when I open this up, the edges should be flush at that neckline area. So again, because of the patterning mistake, they will not be flush at the other end, but ideally they should be if it had been correct on the pattern. Okay, let's take these over to our ironing board and we'll press. Okay, we'll start by cleaning up all of our thread tails. And then we're going to bust open each of those seams. So you can use, now that this is a circle of a garment, you can use your ham to help you get in there and press without getting wrinkles all over the rest of your garment. Okay, and we're gonna do the same thing to our neck facing. Right at those two shoulder seams, we will bust open and press. Okay, now we're ready to attach this to our neckline. So I'm going to get my garment and turn it right side out. Unzip my zipper so I have a nice wide open neckline to work with. And then I'm going to unfold this zipper tape as well so that it's sticking out before I match my facing to my garment. So right here at the shoulder seam on your facing should overlap the shoulder seam on your garment. And then the curve of that neckline should match up perfectly. If it's not matching up perfectly, you may have accidentally put your back facing on backwards. So that curve should just match up, and the raw edge of your facing should come all the way to the edge of your fabric again when it's flipped out. So when we finished our zipper, we folded that back. Right now we're unfolding it and we're having that fabric stick off the edge while we attach our facing. Okay, I'm gonna go around and stack up that other shoulder seam. And do the same to the rest of my back neckline where I'm matching it up, unfolding that zipper seam allowance so I can pin. Okay, and then through the front, your neckline should match up to that curve perfectly as well. And that is right sides together. So you'll notice I did that entire thing with the right side of my facing touching the right side of my garment. Okay, now we're gonna take this over to our sewing machine and we're gonna start at one side where the zipper is open. We're gonna stitch at 1/4 inch and work our way all the way around to the other side. Okay, coming over to our machine, I'm gonna line up the edge of my fabric. So you'll have extra zipper tape sticking off. You can see mine right here. So I'm not paying attention to the edge of the zipper tape. I'm paying attention to the edge of my fabric. And I'm gonna line that up with that 1/4 inch marking on my machine. And we're going to stitch from there, again, all the way over to the other backhand side of our neckline. This is at 1/4 inch. Make sure that as you go around, the edges of your fabric stay flush. You want your facing and your garment to be even with each other. You don't want one to be pulling away from the other. Always checking as you cross your seam allowances that they stay busted open on the top and the bottom. Okay, let's take this back to our ironing board. At this point, this is how your garment should be looking. It's almost like you have a little collar going around the top of your garment. I'm going to clean up my thread tails, and then we're going to begin trimming and clipping. So with facings, there are always 4 steps that you have to do. The first is to trim. So we're going to trim our seam allowances so that we're staggering that fullness. I'm going to put it up on my ham because I just find that a little bit easier to single out those seam allowances so everything else stays out of the way. Okay, I'm going to trim this facing seam allowance down to 1/8. And you can go ahead and trim that zipper tape as well. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is clip. On this, we have a curved seam. We're going to be pressing a smaller curve out to a larger area. So we need to clip so that that fabric can spread as we press it. So going all the way around, I'm going to clip. My clips are about 1/2 inch apart, maybe a little closer, and it's going through both layers. The garment, which in my case is pink, and the facing, which is yellow. The tip of my scissors are getting all the way up to that stitch line, but not cutting through my actual stitch line. So make sure you're cutting as close to that stitch line as you can without going through. You want to make sure that you're using really sharp scissors for this portion so that you don't have to hack at it, and so that you can just use the tip of your scissor or your shear to cut with. If you use the body of your shears and you go like this, it's very easy to cut too far into your stitch line. Okay, so that was step number 2. We did trim was number 1. Step number 2 was clipping. Step number 3 is pressing. So we're going to separate this facing from our garment. So you can see here a wider picture where my facing was originally right sides together with my garment. I'm just going to flip that up so it's sticking off the edge. And what we're going to do is press both of these seam allowances out towards our facing. And again, you'll need to do this on a ham since it is a curved seam. So really separate those 2 layers, pull on them as you're pressing. and press both seam allowances up to your facing. Okay, now step number 4, the last step is going to be an understitch. So this is a new term that we've never heard before. An understitch is when you stitch your seam allowances down to a facing or to an inside layer of fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this on our machine just like this. I have my facing and my garment separate. I can see my seam allowances right in the middle. They're pressed over towards my facing. And what we're about to do is a stitch that's 1/16 inch away from our original stitch line. And it's gonna be on top of those seam allowances, and we're gonna stitch right here on the right-hand side of our seam to stitch those seam allowances down to the facing. So let's take this over to our machine to do that. Okay, over at my machine, again, I still have that garment and that facing layer separate from each other, with my seam allowances pressed over to the facing side. You can see those right there. And I'm going to stitch on that right-hand side of my original seam. So here's my original seam, over to the right, 1/16 of an inch. So this is the same measurement that we use for an edge stitch. I'm using my finger as I go to make sure that those seam allowances are staying down as they go under the foot. You don't want them to accidentally pop up. And then also to just make sure that the area that I'm about to stitch that's right in front of the foot is laying as flat as possible. See how this one is getting popped up in between my toes of my foot? I just adjust that so it goes back down. That one that popped up. There we go. Okay, so from the inside, you should see your original stitch, and then further to the seam, to the facing side, you should see your understitch. From the outside, this is what it's looking like. You have your seam here, and then the understitch is showing up on top of your facing. Okay, take this back to our ironing board again. Okay, so again, that was from the inside, what it looked like. From the outside, you still have that facing sticking off your edge with your understitch showing up now. I'm just gonna clean up my thread tails before I move on. And now I'm ready to flip this to the inside of my garment, and we're going to press that neckline edge. So I have my facing sticking off. Right where my seam is, not my understitch, but right where my seam is, I'm going to fold that facing in. You want the seam right on the folded edge. So from the outside, you can just see pink or garment. From the inside, you just see your facing. And there might be a little border of garment along the edge, but it should be very narrow. I'm gonna press this on my ham, again, because it's a rounded seam. So make sure that you're pulling that garment down and that you're getting that seam right on the edge. We're gonna press that. Just working our way around the neckline. Okay, now we've got to close up that center back area. So you can see right here where we still have raw edges, where our zipper and the edge of our facing is. So temporarily, we're gonna flip that facing back out to the outside, and it should just look like when you put it right sides together, it's gonna look just like that. And we're going to stitch along this edge at 1/2 inch again. So your facing and your garment should be right sides together right here. Again, my zipper, I've unfolded it so that the seam allowance is sticking off the edge, and my facing is right sides together. I'm gonna do the same on the other side. So put my facing back, right sides together with my garment. And then we're gonna use our zipper foot again so that we can get as close to those teeth as possible. So you can see my teeth right here. Those zipper teeth are right under that facing. So when I stitch, I wanna get as close to those zipper teeth as possible and stitch my facing down right next to that. Okay, over at my machine, I have my zipper foot on here again. I'm gonna get my needle on one side to where I can stitch as close to those zipper teeth as possible. So my teeth are over here on the left, so I'm using the foot that has that hole over on the left. Let me get this in the right, but you're gonna have to use some feeling to see where those teeth are so your foot can get up next to them. So use your finger to feel through the fabric for those teeth. Okay, and so you can see where my stitch line is. It's a little bit less than 1/2 inch because we have an extra layer of fabric in there and it creates some bulk. But we're going to get our foot as close up to those teeth as we can when we're stitching. Okay, I'm gonna do the same on the other side. I'm gonna go from bottom up just so I don't have to switch my foot. there's my other side as well. Okay, back over to our ironing board. Okay, clean up those thread tails, and then we're going to turn this right side out. I'm going to miter off my corner as well to reduce some of that bulk when we turn this corner right side out. Okay, and then flip it. We can use our point turner to help us form that corner. And so now when it's flipped, your garment and your zipper teeth should be sticking off the edge, or your zipper teeth should be sticking off the edge of your garment. And then from the inside, you can see that facing has now been attached down to your zipper tape. I'm gonna grab my point turner to help me turn that out. But I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. Miter my corner, and then turn that right side out. There we go, that one was a little easier to do. Okay, and then I'm gonna give that just one last press again on that corner. And so now when I zip up, there we go. So now when I zip up, my facing is sitting on the inside of my garment. The edges of my neckline should be even, and it should look like I have a seam here. On a dress, this little gap that you see at the top from where the pull is to the edge is where you would put your hook and eye to help keep those two edges flush with each other. Okay, and then I'm just gonna press that to get that to form a little bit flatter. And then the last thing we have to do is on the inside, we need to tack our facings down to our shoulder seams with a hand sewing needle. So the reason we wanna do that is because right now this can just flap around on the inside. We don't want that. If this was a garment with lining, right here at the edge of our facing is where our lining would start, and the rest of this garment would be filled up with lining. But if your garment does not have lining, then you would want to serge the edge of your facings. So you would do that before ever sewing them on. You could pre-serge those edges. So, and then we want to, if we don't have lining, we want to tack this down so that it doesn't flap around on the inside. So I'm gonna grab a hand sewing needle and we will do that. Okay, we're gonna do this with a single layer of thread, so make sure that your tails are staggered. I'm going to make sure that that facing is laying nice and flat to my garment, that I'm not pulling it up or pulling it too tight to where I have garment hanging out at the bottom. We want both of those to be flush and even with each other. And then right at the edge, which I'm gonna do it at this shorter edge, again, we had that little mistake, but right at the edge, we're gonna stitch through our seam allowance of our garment and through the facing. And we're just gonna do like a stitch in place where we stitch over that same spot quite a few times. I wanna make sure that my stitches are not showing through on the outside of my garment. So that's why we're stitching through the seam allowance, not through the main body of our garment. And we'll stitch quite a few times to make it secure. And this, if you had serging on it, would get hidden in that serge. So again, as you go, just double check that your stitches are not showing up on the outside of your garment. Okay, then we can cut off our thread tail, and we should have a nice secure stitch so that that facing cannot flap around on the inside. And stitches are not visible from the outside. My shoulder is laying nice and flat. And now my facing is secure. So you're gonna do that on each shoulder seam. So I did that on one shoulder seam. I would need to go and do the same on the other shoulder seam.